To Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, the world's rarest wolf, presented by Jim Knox. Jim is the Curator of Education for Connecticut's Beardsley Zoo and is also a TEDx speaker with more than 3,000 presentations to his credit. It is a pleasure to have you back with us today, Jim. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Great. Kendall, thank you so much for that intro. I just want to express my thanks to the team at Natural Habitat Adventures, to Kendall, to Court, to Ted, and to Ben. You've been wonderful to work with. So thanks once again for this opportunity to share one of the topics we love. In today's presentation, we're going to be obviously exploring the nature and the discovery surrounding the rarest wolf of all, the red wolf. In today's program, we're going to be looking at not only the red wolf historically, but the red wolf in recent time. And when I say recent time, I'm talking about recent developments as of last Thursday, 8 days ago. So with no further ado, here we go. So the American red wolf, if you look at John James Audubon's painting there from the 1800s, this is an animal that was known very well to the settlers and pioneers in the southeastern US in the 17 and 1800s. Unfortunately for the red wolf, because wolves are so incredibly adaptable and so well suited to expanding new territory and establishing new territory through their network of packs, the wolves came into direct contact with these settlers. If you look at the wolf from a Mother Nature standpoint, the wolf is the apex of design, right? We're talking about an animal that has an incredible sense of smell, great sense of hearing, great sense of eyesight, big brain, highly mobile, highly social, plastic social dynamics. We know about one single wolf known as a lone wolf can expand from a pack, and they can form extended family groups. So the wolf has all the tools at its disposal for success. And that means that it put us into direct contact with the wolf with the colonization of North America. The red wolf here, we see it in a lowland, bottomland in the American Southeast on a sandbar, exploring that sandbar, and you see the bison horn right there. Now, in the 1700s and the early 1800s, it was not uncommon to have bison in the eastern US. In fact, the bison's historic range was well down into the southeast, all the way to northern Florida. So with that range extended into the far corners of the American Southeast, the red wolf, the bison, and all these animals that settlers relied on for sustenance, well, they came, again, once into contact with the red wolf. The red wolf was on the losing end of that proposition, and we're going to explore the red wolf's trajectory in just a little bit. Before we do so, I want you to take a moment to look at the red wolf here and look at some of the features that were captured in Audubon's brushstrokes here that are still true today. We have an animal which is definitely wolf-sized at 50 or more pounds. It is medium build, right? It's got very strong, robust musculature, but it's not overly muscular. It's got typically a black tip tail, and again, pronounced reddish tones in the coat. So at a glance, it's going to look different from most other animals that resemble it in form. That reddish appearance comes forth. We're going to go on to our next image here. Now this is a snapshot of an actual red wolf, of course, and now we can look at the animal in greater detail and a little 21st century scrutiny. So if you look at this animal, you might notice a few things. For one, that medium build, again, strong musculature is very evident. Also, like most mammals and like all other wolves, this animal has a lighter ventral side, where the belly is essentially whitish or creamish in color, and the backside is relatively dark. And this is a very fundamental or basic form of camouflage that animals exhibit in the wild. It's called countershading. And countershading enables animals from blue whales to chipmunks to wolves to blend in with their surroundings. But beyond that general countershading design, we've got an animal that has, again, the reddish tones in the coat. We have an animal that has typically a lot of blackish fur along its shoulders and along its flanks. And in the case of the red wolf, like all true wolves, the animal has a stout snout, a very blocky snout, a long snout, but a blocky snout with a very broad nose pad, and also ears which are large, but ears which are relatively small compared to the size of that very large head. And these are some of the hallmarks of the red wolf's physical design. We're gonna go on to our next image here. Now this I love. Not only am I a wolf geek, but I am a map geek. I love maps because maps tell stories. In this case, this map was taken from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, from their data. And the reason I particularly like this map so much is because it is so highly detailed. Whenever we're looking at a species, we're looking at a range map of territory over in the context of a countrywide range, we're looking at broad strokes. You see rounded edges and big blocked out areas. This map is different. If you notice the detail, you're going to see that it actually goes with very fine detail on river systems and along the edges of mountain systems. So this is very accurate. It's based upon red wolf, documented, confirmed red wolf occurrence in the southeastern U.S. What I want you to pay especially close attention to is that reddish, that ruby red zone along coastal Texas, southeastern Texas, and southwestern Louisiana. That's the red wolf's last known range in the wild as of the early 1970s, and that's very central to the red wolf story. Also, I want you to pay attention to the upper northeast, to the northern terminus of the red wolf's range on this map. We notice that the wolf ranged all the way through Long Island and into the Hudson Valley in New York. Now we know that through anecdotal evidence and from several museum specimens that red wolves, actually single red wolves, ranged even farther afield than that, because as you may know, wolves are animals that like to colonize new territory. They're very good at it. With that keen sense of smell and big brain, they're constantly looking for new opportunities to expand their range. And so we do know that individual red wolves, in particular males, have been found in areas up into the Adirondacks in New York, and by anecdotal evidence all the way into New England. If you look at it very closely, you're going to notice sort of the ghost image of a red wolf. If you look up into Mississippi and western Alabama, you're going to see the profile of a red wolf there in ghost image, and that has a little significance later on when we talk about the term of ghost associated with red wolf. So we're going to jump on to the next image here. Now, this is another Audubon painting of an animal known as the Florida black wolf. So why is this significant? Well, the black wolf, as it was known, was exterminated, went extinct by 1908. To this day, though, taxonomists and geneticists can't agree on what exactly the black wolf was in its day. It may have been a melanistic or darker gray wolf, which is possible. It's more probable it was actually a red wolf, which had a preponderance of of melanin in its body, so that it was expressing as a darkish animal, like we have in variation with gray squirrels, for example. We have black phase gray squirrels, and this may have been an analog or the counterpart to that when it comes to the red wolf. But we do know that this animal survived until 1908. Unfortunately, it was hunted and trapped into extinction. And now in the 21st century, by examining museum specimens and looking with a 21st century lens and 21st century technology, we are able to piece together some missing gaps in the story of animals like red wolves. You might notice below the wolf's belly there, the wolf is in full gallop, full sprint. You might notice other wolves that are chasing bison. Now, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, as I mentioned before, bison were found in the American Southeast. In fact, they were found in places we would never even conceive that they would occur, like Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New York State. So that's the black wolf, sadly passed into extinction in 1908. And that was a potential lesson for us. That was a potential warning that we may lose other animals. But at the time, the red wolves were not as valued from a conservation standpoint. Wolves were not valued for their ecological footprint and their ecological impact. Now we know better, and now we can make decisions, wildlife management decisions that incorporate the wolf instead of exclude the wolf. We're going to jump on to the next image, and I want to share something with you. Now that guy is near and dear to my heart and everybody here in our facility in Connecticut's Beardsley Zoo. His name is Peanut. And Peanut is a male red wolf. He is emblematic of our red wolf program here at the zoo, which is part of something called the SSP, or Species Survival Plan. And the SSP is a comprehensive effort to raise the breed, raise the rarest animals on the planet, and very frequently, oftentimes get them back in the wild. Now I say oftentimes because up until very recently, the last few decades, apex predators like the wolf, the red wolf in particular, were never candidates for release in the wild because society didn't value their existence in the wild, at least in certain parts of their former range. That's changed. Thankfully, even though we still face some battles on the public relations front for the red wolf, we know that the red wolf is incredibly important to the health of the wildlands it formerly inhabited. So we have to make room for an animal like this. Now, the red wolf is the rarest wolf of all. That is no hyperbole, right? There are less than 300 red wolves on the planet. Currently, there are approximately 265 of these animals. So every single birth is a tremendous success story for this species. Another chapter in the story of this species. And every single animal is vital toward the preservation of their lineage. As you may imagine, when animals go through a very, very small population stricture, we call them genetic bottlenecks, the animals will lose some of the strength of their genetic legacy, right? They lose some of the valuable genes in that gene pool. And what we're trying to do is expand that at all costs. The challenge is they were so rare that they went down to just a few hundred animals. Specifically, in the early 1970s, red wolves were so rare and coyotes were so prevalent that by virtue of necessity, they were starting to breed with one another and they were hybridizing. And that hybridizing resulted in the wolves literally breeding themselves into extinction. And that was a really tricky problem to tackle. And the US Fish and Wildlife Service did it pretty boldly at the time. And we're going to get into some of the details in the upcoming slides. Maybe we can advance to the next slide. Okay, so here's where the story is really told. The story of the red wolf is told by the numbers. So we'll start out with number 20 because 20 is the number of red wolves presently in the wild. Now I should say presently in the wild as of just a few months ago. But in the last few weeks, that number has dropped even more, believe it or not. The red wolf has been reintroduced into an area in eastern North Carolina known as an experimental non-essential population range. And that's in coastal North Carolina near the Outer Banks. And that area was selected because of the lack of coyotes at the time, and also because it was public land in the contiguous lower 48 that was in the heart of the red wolf's territory that had the deer and the other animals in terms of prey base and had adequate habitat. So wolves are wide-ranging animals. They have extended family groups. They need space. And that ultimately is one of the greatest challenges in reintroducing an animal like a wolf, the sheer space. Going on up to our next number, number 43, that represents the number of conservation institutions caring for red wolves. Number 265, we covered that. That's the number of red wolves currently in existence. 1973 represents the year the red wolf received protection through the Endangered Species Act. And the Endangered Species Act, although it has certain loopholes that have been exploited over the years, perhaps, or certain challenges to it, no piece of legislation is ever perfect. At the time it is created, it may not face the challenges that come with time. But I'm very happy to say that the Endangered Species Act has provided a vital footing for animals that we would clearly and surely have lost. And in this case, thanks to the Endangered Species Act, we have healthy red wolves to prove it. In 1980, the red wolf was declared extinct in the wild. So what happened was in the early 1970s, the Fish and Wildlife Service responded to a dire need on behalf of the red wolf. They realized these wolves were hybridizing with coyotes. So what they did was they licensed federal trappers to live trap all these remaining wolves. They brought in 240 animals from the wild, from southeastern Texas and southwestern Louisiana. Those animals were then screened by US Fish and Wildlife Service veterinarians, by experts in the field, by conservation biologists at the time. We didn't have the genetic information we have now. We didn't have the technology that we have in 2021. And they determined that of those 240 animals, just 17 were candidates for the future of this species. These were deemed to be pure red wolves. Of those, only 14 were healthy enough to go into the breeding program. Some were a little older, some had injuries from the wild. And of those 14, only 12 actually bred. So every single red wolf that we know of in the world is descended from those 12 original founder animals. And that is what we're talking about in terms of a small population that needs our very best effort. 1980 rather, the animal was declared officially extinct in the wild. And just 8 years later, the first pups were born at Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. In 2016, the organization that governs the accredited zoos and aquariums in the US and around the world, known as the AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, formed a task force to examine the effectiveness of endangered species breeding programs. And that task force had some findings that yielded the following. We need to tell the stories of these animals in a better way. We need to have brand recognition, if you will. These animals almost have to be marketed to a public that it's not that the public doesn't care, it's that they may not be aware of the plight of these animals. So with the founding of SAFE, which stands for Saving Animals from Extinction, this program highlighted the need of these animals, from whooping cranes to black rhinos, to elephants, to western pond turtles, sharks and rays, and the American original here, the red wolf. The red wolf is one of the founding animals, and with that program comes increased awareness for the animal, education and conservation efforts, and enhanced revenue resource to protect these animals in the wild. We're going to jump on to the next slide. Those adorable pups, by the way, were born right here at our facility. So if we look here, and I want you to forgive the acuity on the slide just a little bit, because this is one image that I felt really summed up the physical differences, the morphological differences between gray wolves, red wolves, and coyotes at a glance. So once again, wolves are generally much larger than coyotes, but when people see coyotes in the wild, sometimes it may be a large coyote and a small wolf could be virtually similar or almost exactly the same in body size. But the main difference is coyotes have a relatively narrow snout with a small nose pad. Once again, wolves have a blockier snout with a broad nose pad. Coyotes have very pointy ears, which dominate the animal's face profile and head, and wolves have relatively smaller ears. Wolves have a deeper chest, longer legs, bigger paws, and stronger jaws and a much stronger bite. But physically, if we look at the animals, the red wolf is smack dab in the middle. The red wolf has some of the attributes of the gray wolf and some of the coyote. It definitely, given the opportunity, will not breed with either gray wolves or coyotes, and it definitely has that red coat that jumps out at us. We're going to go on to our next slide. Now, the red wolf story took a major turn in 2013. In 2013, there was a gentleman by the name of Ron Wooten. Ron Wooten was spending a lot of time down in a place called Galveston Island State Park in Texas, just about an hour from downtown Houston. And on Galveston Island, he noticed, as a wildlife enthusiast, as a biologist and a photographer, he noticed that the animals there were these beautiful red-coated animals that looked very much like coyotes, but also looked, in some ways, quite a bit different from the standard coyote that was inland just a few miles away. So he took many photos of these animals. He eventually came across two roadkill canids, two of these animals on the road. And being a dedicated biologist and a conservationist at heart, he decided he was going to contact people in academia to see if he could generate interest to identify what made these animals unique, because physically they looked unique. So what he did was he collected a few small samples from these road-killed animals. He was eventually able to reach out to Bridget Von Holt at Princeton University, and she said there was something about his inquiry that caught her interest. He sent these two samples via the mail. The first sample made it in, the second sample did not. So while Dr. Von Holt was processing and testing these and analyzing these samples, the first sample, she responded to him and he said, I only had the two samples. So what he decided to do was he sent the actual scalpel that he'd used to collect the sample. And the researchers at Princeton received the scalpel, they took the DNA from the scalpel, and they were able to run those two unique samples. They compared through genetic analysis the Galveston Island animals you see here, not these particular animals, but some in that population. They compared those to a grouping of 29 coyotes, 10 gray wolves from Yellowstone National Park, 10 eastern wolves from Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, and 11 red wolves from the SSP, the Species Survival Plan. So by comparing all the genetics of all those respective animals, more than 60 animals, they came up with a profile. And the result is that the animals in Galveston Island State Park are not coyotes. They're closer in relation to red wolf, but they're a little bit of neither. They have red wolf genetics known as ghost alleles in their bodies, right? They have ghost alleles, so they have the legacy and the genetic heritage of a red wolf, but some of the lineage of a coyote as well. So why is this important? It's actually tremendously important because it's the first time biologists have ever discovered in the US, have ever discovered an animal at this level, the wolf, an apex predator that had formerly gone extinct. This population that had been managed since the 1970s, well, that population was considered unique, the only population of its kind. And now we know that some of the genetics, which are invaluable and could never be recovered in any other way, are actually alive and well in the animals you see here. And what that led to was biologists casting a wider net and looking at coastal Louisiana and different areas of eastern Texas and in Mississippi to survey the genetics of coyotes in the area. And what they found was astounding. What they discovered was that coyotes in the area, even though they were predominantly, they had the genetics of a coyote, of an eastern coyote, they also had remnants, some of the populations had remnants of red wolf DNA. And what that means for the red wolf is, and for all conservationists and conservation efforts, is that even if we have a species that we take to be unique, if it's gone extinct in the wild, there's a chance that its legacy, in this case through hybridization, the one thing that threatened their very extinction, can actually offer a hope for their continued survival well beyond the 21st century. So I've gone on and on about that fact because I love wolves, and I am a wolf geek. Yes, a map geek and a wolf geek. But I will tell you that this provides genuine hope for the red wolf. We're going to advance a little bit here. And what we're talking about here, if you look at the map, Galveston Island is just a few miles off the mainland from Texas. It's a barrier island, just like the barrier islands in North Carolina, right? So wolves, red wolves are especially adept at surviving in these habitats. It's their home range. And if you look closely, Galveston Island is very, very close. We're going to flip to the next map, is very, very close to that last holdout range of the red wolf in eastern Texas and southwestern Louisiana. In fact, it's offshore just over a mile. So this is exactly what we're talking about. The red wolf's legacy. We were looking far and wide and we thought we had no more red wolves. Well, we have animals that offer this species an enhanced and renewed chance for survival well beyond the 21st century. If you look closely at the map there, the little wolf icon in eastern North Carolina, you're going to see the area we're going to jump into with a little focus in our next image, I believe. We can go into, yeah, oh, sorry, there we go. This is one of the mystery canids that we were talking about. And again, if you notice, it's got a relatively slender snout. It looks very much like a coyote in the head. But if you look at the body, that's a relatively thick body, and it's got a great abundance of red in the coat. Again, with that blackish tip on the tail, which is characteristic of red wolves. We're going to go on to our next slide. Okay, so if you see, Mother Nature likes to tinker with design, but Mother Nature also values a great design, and the design of the wolf is unmatched. So whether we're talking about Arctic wolves above the Arctic Circle, or red wolves in the American Southeast, or Indian wolves in the Indian subcontinent, or their relatives, the Ethiopian wolves in the Bale Highlands of Ethiopia, we're talking about the same basic design, the design for success that has yielded an animal that has dominated the Northern Hemisphere, has the widest range of any animal in the Northern Hemisphere naturally, excluding perhaps humans. So we're going to go on, and I want to share a little something with you here. This is an image of the eastern wolf. Now, the eastern wolf is a fascinating creature. And the more we study any one of these animals, the more we tease one thread from this fabric, the fabric doesn't unravel, it actually tightens and gives us a keener picture on what we're looking at here. In the case of the eastern wolf, this is an animal that is intermediate in size between a red wolf and a gray wolf or a timber wolf, which is the subspecies in this part of the world in north central North America in the upper Great Lakes. And if we go just east of the Great Lakes, what we see is over time, over the last several decades, we see a journey, if you will, a genetic journey from western coyotes migrating across the US from west to east, going through the upper Great Lakes, eventually breeding with wolves because wolf numbers were so low and these coyotes were colonizers in a new range, strangers in that new land. And they bred with these animals, and the eastern wolf, again, is intermediate in size between the coyote and the gray wolf. It's slightly larger than the red wolf, and it has certain characteristics. In many respects, it's the red wolf's closest cousin. It's got preponderance of red in the coat, black tipped tail, the black saddle on the back there, and again, an intermediate size snout. Now, the eastern wolf is an animal that has been greatly studied in recent years because we believe that it holds the key to understanding the relatedness of all these North American canids. The eastern wolf's homeland, if you will, its stronghold is in Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, and that's an area where these animals have survived and thrived without interruption for many decades. We're going to go on to the next image. This is a little aerial image of Algonquin Provincial Park, or perhaps a drone image. And we see that this is somewhat typical of Algonquin. It's a land of many lakes and waterways. We have both coniferous forests in abundance and also hardwood forests. It is a land populated by moose, white-tailed deer, beaver, and other game. It is a wolf's paradise. And this acted as a genetic reservoir so that coyotes could breed with wolves, the wolves could maintain their home range, and then the resultant animals that came about from those pairings populated the northeastern US. And essentially what we had was a vacuum left by the extirpation or the local extinction of wolves that was filled once again by coyotes. The red wolf was the original ambassador, if you will, to the wolf clan in the American Southeast. And the red wolf is I'm determined, from everything I've seen and heard, I'm optimistic that the red wolf will resume its former place in the American Southeast. So we're going to go on to our next image. This is the range map that I was talking about, referring to. This is the non-essential experimental population range in eastern North Carolina. So you see that this is an area which is at sea level, essentially. It is an area marked by creeks, many waterways, both brackish water and fresh water, plenty of game, and originally no coyotes. Now coyotes, again, are so opportunistic and so good at what they do. They have colonized eastern North Carolina, and now they have gone into this range. But with the management lessons learned over the last 30 or so years, we now know how to reintroduce wolves very, very well. In fact, the red wolf reintroduction not only informed, but led the way with best practices for the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone, gray wolves, and the reintroduction of Mexican wolves in the American Southwest, places like Grand Canyon National Park. We're going to go on to our next image. The Endangered Species Act has served the wolf well, as I mentioned, but it's also served hundreds of other species very, very well. And the lessons learned, sadly, from the loss of certain species like the Carolina parakeet and the great auk have led us to informed conservation practice for animals like black-footed ferrets and American alligators. And I'm very, very happy to say that some of those lessons have enabled the re-establishment and the health of an entire species in the case of the American alligator, or the bald eagle being delisted in many, many areas of its former range. We're going to go on to our next image. Now, these adorable guys are part of the next generation effort by Mexican wolves. And when I said that there were some new developments on the front of red wolves, well, they're close cousins of Mexican wolves. We're on the heels of this, so I wanted to bring them into the conversation as well. So just last week, for the first time in history, you can all read that, but the Mexican wolves that were raised in the US by the SSP, or the Species Survival Plan, were released into the wilds of Mexico. And what we're talking about specifically is a group of 9 animals, mom, dad, and their 7 pups that were living at the Albuquerque Biopark in New Mexico, and they were transported across the border with wildlife agencies cooperating in the US and Mexico to bring these animals back to their rightful place in the wild. Now, the Mexican wolf, like the red wolf, was down to perilously low numbers of approximately 20 animals when it was taken out of the wild around 1980, so right around the same time. And I'm happy to say that Mexican wolves are faring slightly better, and they've been reintroduced again into certain wildlife refuges and national lands in the American Southwest. We're going to jump to our next image. Now, this is not only the handiwork of a wolf geek, but as you see, a Star Wars fan as well, because A New Hope actually represents the next chapter in the red wolf's trajectory as a species that is recovering through the help of dedicated individuals. Just last week on Thursday, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was directed to draft a plan for releasing red wolves back into the wilds of North Carolina by March 1st, right around the corner. So there is hope for the red wolf. There is hope in terms of new legislation. There's hope in terms of enlightened attitudes, and there's hope in terms of a genetic legacy that we didn't know existed just a few years ago. I want to jump to our next image, and I want to share something with you, because it's one thing to talk about the species, and it's another to talk about the individuals behind that story, because I think that it's so easy for us to learn those lessons when we have a face for the name. So this is Miss Kwani, and I'll let Kwani take it away from here. Yeah, I know we're working with the two-way audio here, and I should be able to hear you in just a moment, or at least see the chat box. But I want to thank you all for for joining me today and for enabling me to share the programs that we work on here, in particular the Red Wolf program, an animal that really commands our respect and deserves all of our support.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. Yeah, this was wonderful. We've got a lot of good questions for you, and I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question for Jim, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, we've got a lot of good questions, like I said, and there's a lot of curiosity. If you can explain a little bit more about the differences between wolves and coyotes.
Absolutely. So this is one of the most common questions we receive. And again, they're variations on a theme because they're highly successful predators, and essentially the adaptations that they possess enable them to survive and thrive on the landscape. So there's a lot of crossover, but in short, wolves are larger bodied. Wolves have a more robust snout. I wouldn't say it's necessarily blocky, but it's a broader muzzle. Wolves have a more rounded and larger nose pad, which is typically well over an inch in width. And coyotes, their nose pad is quite a bit smaller and more angular. If you think of the coyotes having more sharp edges or angles, that's probably the best way to put it, because it's not unusual to see the ears on the coyote point up. They're quite triangular, whereas the wolf has more rounded tips on the ears. The coyote's ears dominate its head. They're larger compared to the size of the face, the head, and the wolves are relatively small compared to the size of the head. The wolf has a deeper keel or deeper chest. That's an adaptation for running, or you should say striding and loping long distances, maybe 30, 40 miles in a night after an injured moose, for example. They have larger pads, larger paws for displacing their weight over terrain, icy terrain and snowy terrain. Longer legs and just generally a larger body. Their jaws are also proportionately larger. I hope that helps. But at a glance, if you look at the ears, the shape of the snout, and the size of the ears relative to the head, those are definitely good diagnostics for the field.
So there's a few people who are really curious about what happened to those wolves that were initially brought in, that they did the testing on to check their purity, especially the wolves who were a hybrid.
Sure. You mean the wolves that were originally taken in by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or the other wolves in Galveston?
Right. Yeah, the wolves who were initially brought in, yeah.
My understanding, and I would have to go back, this is in the early 1970s, really definitely before my time as a conservationist, but my understanding is that those wolves, I do not believe those wolves were harmed. If I want to kind of get to the heart of the question there, I believe that all of those wolves were kept for, wolf and wolf hybrids were kept in observation to determine the lineage of the animals and the provenance of each individual animal. Again, we didn't have the genetic testing that we have now. Now you'd be able to just take a small biopsy, draw a little blood from an animal that might have been darted, and you could do that harvest that DNA in the field. But in this case, I believe that I know that the wolves were brought in from the wild, and I know that one of the main sites at the time was the Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium in Tacoma, Washington. And Point Defiance spearheaded this entire program, and the animals that were brought into Point Defiance, eventually, many of those went out to other zoos around the country. And our facility, Connecticut's Beardsley Zoo, got involved in the program in the late 1980s. So we were very fortunate to be one of the first zoos included in this cohort.
So there's a lot of curiosity about whether or not there's any concern about the gene pool, since so many of these wolves originated from those 12.
Absolutely, it is definitely a concern. And when you speak to conservation biologists, geneticists, anybody who's involved in conserving endangered creatures, especially endangered creatures that are perilously low in their numbers, that concern doesn't ever go away. So one of the things that the AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, has instituted is a color-coded system for these SSP programs. And I'm sorry to be throwing all these acronyms around. It makes your head spin, I know, but the SSP, the Species Survival Plan, has 3 different color ratings or designations. They are red, yellow, and green, if you think, like a stoplight setup. Red would be critical, yellow or amber less so, and green, these animals have a greater population base to go forward in the future. The long and short of it is, with animals that are in the red designation, those species get the intense scrutiny and benefit from the latest genetic knowledge, the latest conservation techniques, and really they're pushed to the forefront in terms of the resources available to them. What we find is, and it's probably a longer conversation than we have time for today, what we find is that the animals that are in those highest levels, some of them are, we're looking at the degree of relatedness. They're pretty closely related. So what conservation biologists do is they select the most distantly related animals from from these subsequent generations, and they pair them together. whenever possible, in the case of, say, Amur tigers, we used to call them Siberian tigers, but Amur tigers in the Russian Far East, periodically there will be animals that will be intercepted in maybe the exotic animal trade, which is illegal, black market live trade in animals. And some of those animals, if they meet veterinary muster, their genetics can be introduced to a program. So animals from the wild, like for example, black rhinos, it is possible to be managing a population in human care, direct human care in zoos around the world, but also harvest reproductive material, sperm and eggs from animals in the field without harming the animals whatsoever, and then taking that genetic material and introducing that to the population which is managed in human care. That is one way in which populations don't have to be taken from the wild as a last-ditch effort, and yet the genetics can flow from one population to another, and it makes both more robust. I know I went on for a long time on that answer. There's more to it, but that's the best way I can sum it up.
That's so fascinating. So are there any plans to help prevent coyotes and red wolves from breeding in the Alligator River Reserve area?
The short answer is stay tuned. And I hate to go to that. I'm not trying to be evasive. The Fish and Wildlife Service has learned invaluable lessons from the introduction of red wolves. Again, this is an animal that represents the first apex predator to be reintroduced to the landscape in North America ever. So we know that the coyote is an incredibly adaptable, very plastic species, if you will, right? They can interbreed with wolves readily. They can colonize new territory. They live within city limits of every one of our top 25 largest cities in the US. So they're even more adaptable than wolves. So among other things, there have been proposals for coyote-free zones, which include fencing, which is fraught with challenge, right? As we know, conservation challenge when you erect fencing. They're also, the Fish and Wildlife Service, from what I understand, is looking at new release sites, are always looking for prospective new release sites for the animals. The original release sites included barrier islands and islands off the southeastern coast of the US and the Gulf Coast that had no native canids on the island, so no coyotes at all. I know that nothing is off the table when it comes to mustering resources for this species. So we'll see what happens, but I'd be happy to do my homework on it and get back to you. Not this particular question, but Kendall, I'll get back to you. Maybe we can do a wrap up on that.
Yeah, sure. So how are the wild red wolves tracked currently?
So the wild red wolves, from my understanding, the wild red wolves that are currently out there, and again, this represents truly just a handful of animals, are radio collared. At the very least, they're radio collared, or rather they are microchipped, so that they have a very small chip in their ear, which is about the size, and when I say small, it's a little bit more slender than, but about the size of a grain of rice. So, you know, very, very tiny. And then they typically have a collar. As you saw that one red wolf running free in North Carolina, that animal had a collar around its neck, a red collar. So normally we have a redundancy built in so the animals can be located in that manner, and that helps.
What kind of conservation and breeding programs are there right now? And also, is there a way to reverse engineer, so to speak, the hybrids between red wolves and coyotes?
Yes, so there are multiple conservation programs in effect. I keep referring to the species survival plan. I think in many respects, the program that actually holds the most hope for red wolves and other critically endangered animals is the SAFE program, the Saving Animals from Extinction program. And the reason I say that is because the SAFE program really helps to market, if you will, and I don't want to use these terms like these animals are tubes of toothpaste. They're not, right? They're living, breathing things. However, if the public isn't made aware of the plight of these animals through aggressive promotion, conservation, education-based promotion, where we say, this is a red wolf, this is where it lives, this is why it's imperiled, and this is what we can do to help it. If we don't have those sorts of programs like the SAFE program, people are busy. Life is very fast-paced, and we lose we lose opportunities to protect these animals. Programs like the SAFE program, what they do is they partner conservation science with education effort, and they also channel resources, desperately needed resources, to these animals in the field where it's needed most. And also on the research front with universities like Princeton and Michigan Tech University, their counterpart on that study. The second part of the question, Kendall, was, can you remind me of that second part B there?
Is there a way to reverse engineer, so to speak, the hybrids to bring the red wolf back?
In a word, yes. It's a qualified yes. There are means in which to bring these animals back, so to speak. There is a procedure, or there is a process or a conservation strategy known as backbreeding, and backbreeding is actually used for endangered domestic animals as well, like heritage breeds, like guinea hogs or Tamworth pigs, right? And what backbreeding entails is breeding the animals which exhibit the traits, the genetic traits of the ancestors to essentially concentrate those traits. And what you're doing is you're breeding animals which have those respective traits. Of maybe in the case of heritage breeds, it might be coat color, it might be mass, it might be milk production, whatever it may be. In the case of wolves, you could do it via both morphological traits, the visual traits you can see on the animal, as well as, and more importantly, the genetic traits of the animal. You would actually know, you could sample these animals and you could determine their degree of relatedness, their relative abundance of red wolf DNA, or the segments of the red wolf genome present in the animal. And also, and this is really, really key, and I didn't mention this before because I got really into the presentation, but one of the things that the Princeton and Michigan Tech study revealed was that the wolves in Galveston Island, not only are they related to their ancestors that were taken from the wild decades ago, but they also have a unique genetic variation. And those are the exact words used in the summary report for Princeton on this animal's genetic legacy. It has a unique genetic variation that isn't seen anywhere else. So what does that mean? Well, what it really means is you can reinvigorate. You can give the red wolves a proverbial shot in the arm genetically by bringing those genetics back into the conversation and back into practice.
So are you optimistic about the future of the red wolf, and how can people follow its story?
Thank you. I am optimistic, and I say I'm optimistic because I've been on the roller coaster for a while, right? I know the downs as well as the ups, and I know that we are definitely on an upward trend in that. In the last week alone, even though red wolves and Mexican wolves are independent species, their conservation advocacy and conservation practices are very, very closely linked. They're like, intertwined, really. So when I see that in the span of just a week or two, we have these developments on the reintroduction front, that is very, very comforting. When I see that this is on the heels of an unknown reservoir of genetic wealth that was discovered in Texas just 2 years ago, that gives tremendous hope for the future. Even if we don't have the genetic techniques in place in 2021, by 2027 or 2028, we're going to be in a better position to manage these animals by managing them through their genetics. And also, I'm optimistic because the folks that are stewards for these species, they are, to use a dog phrase, they're like a dog on a bone, right? They love these animals, and they really do, and they pour their hearts into their work. There's a gentleman by the name of Will Waddell who's been working, just been consulting with the Red Wolf program recently, and Will has been a stalwart champion for the Red Wolf for decades at a Point Defiance Zoo. So the people that are supporting this effort are not doing so casually. They're putting everything into it. And I think through opportunities such as this, by speaking to the natural habitat adventures community, it expands the scope of advocacy for an animal like the red wolf. So yes, I'm very optimistic.
That's wonderful. So final question today, someone wants to know where they could make a donation.
For the Red Wolf program?
There is no specifics. They just want to know how they can help.
Okay, that's a very good question, and I'm not exactly stumped, but I really want to think on that, and I don't have the opportunity to probably get back to you. I would say there are a few things that they can do in terms of advocacy and/or voting with their dollars, right? You could. I would encourage you to read as much as you possibly can on the developments of the Red Wolf program in the coming months through this spring and this summer, because there's going to be a lot of activity on that front. You could contact the Fish and Wildlife Service, probably, although they're stewards of our wildlife, they're really not a fundraising arm for wildlife. There are wonderful organizations like Defenders of Wildlife, the National Wildlife Federation, that do stalwart work on the wolf front. If you have the inclination, there are zoos all over the U.S. who participate in the SAFE program, the Saving Animals from Extinction program. Many of them have the ability to, you could contact them, send them an email and say, I'd like to support your Red Wolf work. How do I do it? And they can direct it toward their conservation fund. For example, we have one at our facility that helps not only wolves, but helps tigers, or leopards, Atlantic salmon, giant armadillos, you name it. So if you specifically direct it from one of your regional or local zoos that participate in the SAFE program, they can make sure that money gets to the people who can use it most, the conservation biologists.
All right, wonderful. Well, Jim, thank you so much for taking the time to present today. This was absolutely fascinating, and I really want to thank you for educating us more on this amazing animal. I'm going to hand it back over to you to make any closing comments.
Kendall, I echo my thanks to you and the team at NHA. This is just to have a platform to share the work that we conduct day to day and year in and year out is tremendously appreciated. So I thank all of you. I encourage everybody, if they're interested, to follow up, and like I said, just keep reading. The students ask us all the time, little kids ask us all the time, how can we help animals like the red wolf? And we tell them, seriously, there are 3 things you can do. You can read, and when you're done with that, you can read some more. We are not kidding. The more you read, the more empowered you are. And as citizens, we vote with our dollars, and we make those decisions that help animals like the red wolf. So I thank you once again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again, Jim. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. Next week's lineup is on our website, and keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news announcement. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great weekend.